All right, good evening and welcome families. My name is Anita Arjoyan and I am a teacher specialist with the Equity Access and Family Engagement Department. I'd like to start off by thanking you all for being here tonight. But before we begin, I'd like to get our interpretation feature going. I'll ask our interpreters to introduce themselves and give directions on how to access the interpretation feature. Interpreting and translating in Armenian, Ms. Vardui Lafayette.
Բարի երեկո ձեզ սիրելի ծնողներ եւ դիտողներ, այսօր վեբինար ենք անցկացնելու, իմ անունս Վարդուհի է եւ ես հայերենի թարգմանիչն եմ, եթե ցանկանում եք ծրագիրը հայերենով լսել, խնդրում եմ սեղմեք հայերենի վրա եւ չաթում տեղեկացրեք, եթե ինձ լսողներ կան, շնորհակալություն.
Thank you, and then we have Ms. Jane Park providing Korean translation.
안녕하십니까. 한국어 통역인 제인팍입니다. 오늘 저녁에 이 프레젠테이션을 한국어로 들으실 수가 있습니다. 그 들으시는 방법은 그 스크린 맨 아래 그 지구본의 아이콘을 누르시고 한국어를 선택해 주시면 그때부터 한국어 통역을 들으실 수 있습니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you, and Ms. Aurora Alfaro Rosas, she will be translating for our Spanish speakers.
Muy buenas tardes, padres de familia. Bienvenidos al webinario ¿Qué es un estudiante superdotado? ¿Y cuáles son sus necesidades socioemocionales de esos estudiantes superdotados? Y para eso esta noche tenemos a la presentadora Christine Fonseca. Bienvenidos. Y si alguien necesita interpretación en español, por favor, en el espacio donde dice, donde está el globito terráqueo, ahí van a presionar para escuchar la interpretación en español. Muchas gracias y bienvenidos de nuevo.
Thank you, and with that I will start the feature. All right, thank you. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Oscar Macias, the Director of the Equity Access and Family Engagement Department.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending Glendale Unified's GATE Family Institute. Today is Thursday, September 14th, and as mentioned, my name is Dr. Oscar Macias. I am the proud director of our Equity Access and Family Engagement Department. I want to extend my gratitude to our participants, our speaker, Mrs. Fonseca, our interpreters on Zoom, and again, Ms. Anita Arjoyan for her organization of this event. I would like to establish some guidelines for tonight's presentation. Number one, please be assured that this webinar will be recorded and posted on our website within 72 hours. Secondly, as questions come up, type them into the Q&A box feature found at the bottom of the screen. At the end of our presentation, we will try to answer all of your questions. So, as mentioned, tonight we do have a very amazing featured speaker, our presenter, Ms. Christine Fonseca, here with us. She will be discussing what is giftedness and understanding the social and emotional development of gifted children. Mrs. Fonseca is a licensed educational psychologist, a critically acclaimed author, and a nationally recognized speaker on the topics related to educational psychology, mental health, and giftedness. Thank you, Mrs. Fonseca, for being here with us for Glendale Unified. I will now turn it over to you.
Fantastic. And I'm so excited to be here. You guys are some of my favorite people to come and visit and talk to. I'm going to share my screen right now. Oh, I can't. So hopefully Anita will let me share my screen and then I'll get on the presentation for you guys. But I'm very excited to be here. Giftedness is something I'm super passionate about. A little bit about me. I am not only a psychologist who trains and works with our gifted families and gifted individuals. I am a gifted adult. I have gifted children. My husband is gifted. So at any given time, we're just a very intense gifted family at any time. And so we'll talk a little bit about what that means tonight and kind of ways that you can help support your gifted child in terms of their social and emotional development. Oh, look, it works. Thank you. All right, let me share my screen and start this. All right. There we go. Okay, so to get started, a little bit about what giftedness is. I like to think of giftedness as more than performance on an IQ test or how a child is doing in school. It's really referring to a collection of traits and talents that affect all aspects of a person, from cognition to their personality development to their social emotional development. We're going to spend most of the time tonight talking about those social and emotional pieces, but I do want to start off just by kind of having a foundation of understanding of what's happening in the brain when we talk about giftedness. So giftedness is really referring to 4 different kind of broad areas of development. The first one's neurodiversity, and we'll go over what that means. And then there's a collection of intellectual traits and personality traits and social emotional traits that are common in our gifted population. Let's talk a little bit about the neurodiversity first. This is kind of the fun, geeky, sciencey stuff that I like to get into. I promise I won't make it like, I don't know, a bio class. We'll try to make it a little bit more fun. So first and foremost, our gifted kids really do have bigger brains. The gray matter in our brains that kind of hold and store information, they actually just have a higher amount of volume. So if you feel like your gifted child just knows a lot of stuff and kind of stores interesting little facts in their brain, they do. That's pretty accurate. They also have what we would consider really connected brains. What do I mean by this? I mean the white matter in the brain, which is kind of the connective tissue is a way to think of it, are more efficient and they're very connected brains. So the right brain and left brain are having great conversations with one another. And the top part of the brain and the bottom part of the brain are having great conversations with one another, making them very efficient. When all of this is happening the way it does with a gifted child, it just makes for very efficient brains that work very quickly, that are able to integrate information in a slightly different way. Here's what I find so interesting, though. Not only are those things true about our gifted population, but our gifted kids also have highly sensitive brains. What I mean by this is that they take in more information through their 5 senses than their neurotypical counterparts. So when your child says that light is really, really bright, or you change the fabric softener at home and your child has a really strong reaction to it because they notice the difference, these things really are true. Our gifted kids are just taking in more information. This can really be impacting at home when it comes to things like sound or visual stimuli or things like that. Sometimes food sensitivities really come up. All of these things are just because of how a gifted brain tends to work. Our gifted children also have highly efficient brains in terms of the way those connections are working, and it kind of makes them more capable or more naturally able to have really high brains with EQ or emotional development. We'll spend a lot of time talking about that in more detail in just a little bit. And all of this collectively makes for brains that are really prone to high levels of resiliency, even though when they're younger, it may not look like that. It may seem like they're having some more difficulties with some of those social emotional things, and we'll get into why that is in just a minute. So let's talk a little bit about the intellectual attributes of giftedness. First and foremost, these intellectual attributes are what we tend to think of when we're thinking about what giftedness even is. These are things like being curious intellectually or having really good reasoning skills. Maybe they're an early reader or they're particularly adept at doing some sort of math problems. They might have really complex thoughts at a very young age, or perhaps the way their giftedness shows up is with really vivid imaginations. My own children had a lot of these things kind of show up, as did I when I was young. And really, our gifted kids have a strong passion to learn. Now, you notice I didn't write a strong passion for school. They may or may not have that, depending on how much the school system itself is able to kind of meet the needs of our gifted kids and how well they're kind of adjusting to the requirements of school. But even if they're struggling a little bit within an academic environment, this doesn't mean that they don't have a strong passion for learning. I've worked with thousands and thousands and thousands of gifted kids, and I can assure you they all like to learn. They just don't necessarily like to learn what we need them to learn. In addition to those intellectual things, we also have all kinds of personality attributes that are true for our gifted children. Things like the need for mental stimulation, or the need to understand their world around them, the need for things to make logical sense, or for things to have some sense of precision. And sometimes this manifests as a need to be perfect in things. Most of our gifted families are really used to dealing with perfectionism inside their homes. And then also there's high levels of sensitivity. We're going to talk more about perfectionism and sensitivity in just a little bit when I get just a tad further. But really, I kind of want you to just really know that these are just some normal attributes of what it means to be gifted. If I needed one word or used one word to summarize the kind of reality that our gifted humans are dealing with, it would be intense. These are just a really, really intense group of students, an intense group of humans, and really interface with their world in a really intense way. All right. Let's really drill down on the social emotional aspects. Now, one thing that I have found really interesting in the research with giftedness, and really kind of the way I think about giftedness, I want you to conceptualize it like a coin. On one side, we have all of those intellectual traits that I just talked about. And typically speaking, those are really positive traits, right? We have really exciting, positive things to think about. Oh my gosh, he's so smart, or look how talented he is, those kinds of things. The other side of that coin is some of the emotional aspects of what it means to be gifted. And unfortunately, we don't always call those things in those same positive terms. When I talk about what emotional intensity is in just a minute, you'll kind of see why that is. And unfortunately, that means that sometimes our gifted kids grow up believing that part of who they are is really great and awesome and fun, but another part of who they are is not quite as good. And that's something that we as parents want to really make sure we kind of reshape for our gifted kids. I'll explain more what I mean in just a minute, but before I go into that, I want to talk a little bit about what we know about how our social and emotional development occurs in our gifted families. First and foremost, most of our gifted kids have really high performance standards. So high performance standards is a more positive way of thinking of perfectionism. I kind of like to think about it like this. If I were a basketball player and I was practicing my three-point jump shot over and over and over, nobody would think anything of that. In fact, if I was a professional ball player, you all would want me to do that because you really want to make sure that I score when I need to in the high stakes game. If I was a writer and I was spending hours and hours and hours agonizing over a single paragraph of text, you probably wouldn't worry about that either because you as a reader want to make sure that you really enjoy that novel. Our gifted kids have that same kind of high performance standard. They'll work really, really hard to make sure something's perfect. And if it can't be perfect, they can get really frustrated. A lot of times we call that perfectionism. And perfectionism is kind of the negative side of high performance standards, but there are much more positive sides to it as well, which we'll talk about some more. Our gifted kids also have a really strong internal motivation. That doesn't always equate to doing one's homework, and we'll talk about that in a sec too. They have a really high sense of moral maturity, strong resiliency. We'll talk about the self-actualization piece and then that emotional intensity. Let's break down each one of these areas into really specific detail, and then you can kind of see some of the things we can do to support them. I do give Anita a copy of this, and so I'm sure she can get this to you. I'm perfectly fine sharing this with our families. That high performance standard, I already kind of explained what that was a little bit. If the high performance standard attribute, that's a normal part of what it means to be gifted, if some of the skills around that aren't fully developed, some of our coping strategies, some of our social emotional skills, The way that starts to look is like that unhealthy perfectionism, that kind of perfectionism that causes our kids to procrastinate on some of their work or to have big mood swings. Perhaps for you, it looks like World War III at home when you're doing homework. It can get really bad. That's what can happen if some of these social emotional skills aren't highly developed with our gifted kids. Some of the things we can do about that are things like encouraging a growth mindset or really helping our kids discern between what they want to do and what the teacher asked them to do. Sometimes there's a mismatch there. Sometimes our kids are trying to do different activities that are beyond their skill level because it's what they picture in their mind. These kinds of things can throw that high performance standard a little out of whack. I mentioned that they have a strong internal motivation. Sometimes that doesn't mean homework. I mentioned that as well. So what is this internal motivation? This is that passion for learning that they have. And this can combine with that high performance standards. And if they don't have strong social emotional skills, if they're getting overwhelmed, this can start to look like poor resiliency. It can even start to look like anxiety. So with some of our kids, we really need to teach them, again, that growth mindset or some optimism or things like that to really help them with some of these skills. They have a strong sense of right and wrong, which we would define as a moral maturity. But sometimes when they're younger, that's a very rigid perspective. They really see things as all right or all wrong, and they have a hard time kind of floating in that gray area in between. Sometimes this can even result in some peer interaction difficulties. I want to kind of assure you, though, that this is all part of what it means to be gifted. And if we can provide things like social skills training or some perspective taking or teaching some conflict resolution, we can help our children kind of get past the rigid part of all of this and get more to that moral maturity. Because of the way our gifted kids' brain is developed, they tend to have this great capacity for resilience. And in this sense, I'm defining resilience as that ability to bounce back after a setback. But when some of their social emotional skills are still underdeveloped, like when they're younger in the preschool ages or early elementary school ages, or even the beginnings of middle school, perhaps, they might have some difficulties kind of dealing with overwhelm or dealing with some of their peer interaction difficulties, which could really start to look like emotional distress. One of the things we can do is, again, work on optimism and teaching emotional self-regulation with our kids, and it can be really, really helpful. All right, I want to talk the big one. The big one is self-actualization. That's a really kind of a big topic. It's kind of a hard topic to understand. I want you to think of it this way. All human beings at some point in their life deal with this, who am I and why am I here? Or to put it as Hamlet, kind of to be or not to be question. And all human beings deal with this. I always joke that the reason kids still take Philosophy 101 when they're in college is because they're wrestling with this who am I and why am I here kind of construct. Self-actualization with our gifted kids means that they're dealing with these kinds of questions at a very, very young age, sometimes as young as 3 and 4 years old. They're wondering what the point of life is, and they're wondering what kind of their role or their purpose is in life. This can be really, really difficult if you don't have coping skills to deal with some big problems. And because our gifted kids tend to be very observant and very aware, they become very aware of big, giant, worldwide problems that are happening at a very, very young age, and they don't always know what to do about that or what their role is with that. As the adults in our children's lives, as parents, we can really help them with this by focusing on talent development and learning to kind of involve themselves in the things they're passionate about, teaching some of those relaxation skills and coping skills. The good news is our gifted kids are not prone to high levels of depression, but they can really be impacted by existential depression, which is that wrestling with the who am I and why am I here concept. And as parents, there's just a lot we can do to really help with that. All of this means that our gifted kids are really prone to very nice, highly developed levels of empathy at a very young age. However, again, if they don't have all those social emotional skills in place, that empathy can start to look like emotional enmeshment. You know that this is going on as a parent when your child comes home, tells you all about their friend and their friend's woes, the things that are impacting their friend's life, and they start having these big emotional reactions around it. That's kind of your clue that they may be taking on the emotions of their friends and they don't know how to put those boundaries up at all. As parents, we can really help them with perspective taking and, again, being able to discern, are these my feelings or my friend's feelings? How can I help my friend without taking on the emotions of my friend? And these kinds of skills can really go a long way to helping mature some of this attribute that they have, which is the strong empathy. I want to spend the next, 10 minutes or so, if I can get my computer to go forward. Here we go. Come on. There we go. And talk a little bit about what it means to have emotional intensity. Just like I mentioned before, our gifted kids all pretty much have this intellectual intensity. And what we're finding in the research is they also are very prone to emotional intensity, the other side of that coin. So what is emotional intensity? Emotional intensity is having extreme emotions all the time, and usually going back and forth between these strong emotions so fast, we practically need a scorecard just to keep up. They might be really, really happy one minute and then really, really sad the next minute, or they might be going back and forth between both of them, which can sound a little like some of our mental health challenges. With most of our gifted kids, it actually doesn't mean a mental health challenge at all. It's just what it means to be gifted. Oftentimes, this then can look like a mood disorder or having poor emotional control. But many times, really what's going on for our child is they're just feeling really big feelings in a really intense way. And they haven't learned some of the coping strategies or even the emotional language to talk about those big feelings. That can result also in that extreme empathy that I mentioned before, where they're taking on the difficulties of others or they're overreacting to different kinds of peer interaction difficulties. And we just have to be aware that this is an aspect of giftedness and help support our child if we see that happening. Sometimes emotional intensity is going to take on a physical appearance. It's going to look like headaches or heart palpitations or stomach aches or even kind of borderline panic disorders. Now, of course, just like any student, our gifted child might wind up with some panic issues or some diagnosable anxiety conditions. These things can exist together. But a lot of times what's really happening is it's our giftedness and the way we're responding to those intense emotions and just not having a skill set. And because most of our gifted kids don't understand what it means to be gifted, they don't always know that this is just part of the gig, right? This is part of what happens, and they don't know how to manage it. Once again, we as parents can really help with that by practicing things like mindfulness. If you are a faith-based family, you can use prayer. If you are more into kind of checking in with your body, you can do biofeedback. Like there's all kinds of different ways that we can learn the physical side of emotional reactions and then learn how to manage that. Behavior inhibition is something that comes up in the literature a lot around emotional intensity, and it's just a really fancy way of saying I am inhibited or I am restrained in my behavior. It's often what we call shyness. So when a student or a child who's gifted appears to be hesitant to engage behaviorally in various situations, looks a little aloof or uncaring, might even start to look like social anxiety. When they were young, they might have had a lot of separation anxiety. All of these things can be related to the giftedness more so than a mental health condition, and oftentimes is a kind of a byproduct or what happens as a result of extreme levels of stress. Perhaps maybe they're a gifted introvert, meaning they need some downtime, that crowds or lots of people overwhelm them. I know with my gifted kids, gosh, taking them to Disneyland starts off great, and then it's a disaster a little while later. Those kinds of things can happen. And so it's really just helping kids learn how to read their own needs, learn how to manage their stress. And again, some of these skills, as they learn them, really start to mature out some of these problems that appear to show up. A lot of our gifted kids have what's called a strong affective memory. affective memory relates to the emotional aspects of memory. So they're not only remembering a situation, but they're remembering the emotional construct of that situation too. This can be particularly impactful if the situation involves some trauma. If there was a death in the family, if there was a sudden move, or just a move in general. Sometimes our gifted kids are just impacted when the family moves for some reason, or if their favorite toy got broken, or these kinds of things can really relate to the strong affective memory aspect that's part of being gifted. Existential depression is really in line with that self-actualization piece that I talked to you about. So a lot of times our gifted kids may express what on the outside looks like thoughts of death or morbid thoughts. It might not be that. It might just be wrestling with the who am I and why am I here kinds of questions, and that to be or not to be kind of ideology. And so it really just depends on the context that our children are engaging in this conversation. The more we can be involved in our kids' lives, the more we can have open conversations with our kids, the more we can start to figure out whether or not this is something that needs to raise our concern. And by all means, if you're ever concerned about your child having thoughts of death or suicidal ideations, absolutely have that checked out, whether it's through the school or through one of the mental health providers in the community. Okay, a couple of other things that come up with emotional intensity. This last one on the slide, the feelings of inadequacy or critical self-evaluation, that one comes up a lot in our school settings. A lot of times that perfectionism or that high performance standard comes into play, and kids will experience some academic difficulty even when they're gifted, even when they're completely capable of doing the work for a variety of reasons. Maybe they misunderstand the assignment and they think it's harder than it actually is. Maybe they're not really able to take an academic risk because they've never been pushed or challenged before. And now all of a sudden they're in a class that's kind of hard and they don't know what to do with those feelings of discomfort that we all get when something's a little bit more challenging. Maybe they have some anxious-like behaviors that come up with some of that. All of these are kind of aspects of what it means to be gifted in terms of the emotional intensity piece. Same thing with the difficulties in transition. I always think of my kids with this one. So my children, when they were little, used to have, there was something, I'm going to date myself incredibly right now, but there used to be this toy. It was fantastic. It was called Ello. It was for targeting, it was marketed towards girls, but it was for either girls or boys. And it was like Legos, sort of, except not, but it was super cool, came in great colors, all these neat shapes, and you could build stuff with them. And my kids used to take hours and build these elaborate setups for a game that would literally take like 4 or 5 hours for them to set up. And then I would tell them it was time to clean up and they'd look at me like I had 3 heads, right? And they'd get really upset because here they were, they just spent 4 hours setting up this game that they never actually played. And so we had to have some dialogue around that and have some agreements around that so that they could keep that play stuff out and then continue that game later on or those kinds of things. But this was a learning process for us because initially that difficulty with transition, being able to move on to something else, it would turn into an argument or a temper tantrum or those kinds of things. And it was pretty easy to misread what was going on. What was really happening is they were just very involved in their very elaborate game and they couldn't understand why they had to put it away after they had invested so much time. Now, on a happy note, both of my children are artists, and one of them in particular is a professional artist and kind of gets to do that same thing that she was doing with those Ellos, but she does that now for a living. And so you never know where some of these fantastical things that they're doing when they're little, where that's all going to wind up. So it's that balancing act for us as parents between helping nurture these passion areas that they have, but also help them, follow household rules, follow school rules in terms of times, learn about time. Really are time constraints, all of those kinds of things that are really important for us to learn when we make the transition through our childhood into adulthood. All right. I really wanted to make sure I had a little time to talk about one more aspect about what it means to be gifted and kind of taps into some of the social emotional pieces. But it's this idea of areas of intensity. So forever ago, 1930s, I think is when, there was a theory called the theory of positive disintegration. And it was really this theory of how do humans kind of grow up and change their thinking on some things. And as Dabrowski was the researcher, as they were researching this area and kind of learning about this, they stumbled across upon this construct of having these 5 areas of overintensity or overexcitability that seem to really correlate with our gifted individuals. Since that time, there's been quite a bit of research in this area, and what they're finding is that there are, in fact, various areas of overexcitability that our gifted children demonstrate, in particular, intellectual and emotional. We just spent quite a bit of time going through emotional, but we'll do a little bit more. And then for some of our gifted kids, there's this psychomotor piece, sensual piece, and imaginational piece, which we'll go into. Let's talk first about the intellectual and emotional, because the vast majority of our gifted individuals have these character traits that just show up. So intellectual intensity, those are kids who are those intense problem solvers. They get good levels of concentration, particularly in areas that are important to them. They might have a strong visual recall. We call that an eidetic memory. They love to learn for the sake of learning. Now, sometimes this can result in having some underdevelopment in their social emotional skills. We like to think of that as asynchronous development. That means the different aspects of who we are as human are kind of developing at different rates. Sometimes it can result in too much thinking and not enough feeling, which tends to weaken our relationships sometimes. It might make us particularly threat aware, those kinds of things. But really, there's a lot of strengths and intellectual intensity, right? These are strong leaders, good memory. They tend to do well in school, these kinds of things. Emotional intensity, like I said, we just went through. The majority of our gifted kids do demonstrate signs of emotional intensity as well. And that's going to include things like this super passionate approach to life, the emotions, the way we've discussed them, having complex and layered emotions, physical reactions, the capacity to develop really deep relationships at a really young age. Some of the problems that can arrange with that, if we're too much in our heart and not enough in our head, then we might have some difficulties with what we call cognitive regulation. Cognitive regulation is like attention management and being able to actually get stuff done, like those kinds of things, instead of just being a dreamer, right? It can result in what we call underdevelopment of theory of mind. That's that idea that I am a human and you and a human, and we are actually separate beings. Some of our kids actually have a hard time developing some of those thoughts. This can be particularly true if we're twice exceptional. That means we're gifted and we'll talk about that at the end just a little bit. Sometimes if our emotional intensity is a little out of balance, this might lead to some emotional distress. But the strengths aspect of this are just really passionate people who have really strong compassion for others. They might have high levels of empathy and good levels of resilience and just a general zest for life that we all need to be able to kind of propel us through, especially when things are a little bit more challenging. Now, there are 3 other areas of overexcitability, and typically speaking, our gifted kids are going to show 1 or more of these areas as well. Every now and then we get those gifted kids that are kind of showing all of these. It's important to note that if we have a gifted child who's kind of showing all of these areas of intensity, that can be somewhat problematic in a kind of a traditional learning environment. They may have a few more difficulties just with peers and whatnot, because they are really getting, tend to be our profoundly gifted, or our students who, again, are twice exceptional. They're gifted and. So gifted and autistic, gifted and learning disabled, gifted and ADHD, gifted and mental health, gifted and. Okay, so let's look at what those 3 other areas are. Okay, first and foremost, we have psychomotor intensity or psychomotor overexcitability. These are kids who love action. They tend to talk for the sake of talking or move for the sake of moving. They couldn't sit still if their whole life depended on it. They tend to be very animated in their speech patterns. They might be heavy risk takers. You know, they're the ones who are skateboarding or bikers or those kinds of things. Sometimes our kiddos who have really strong levels of intensity in psychomotor overexcitability might get misdiagnosed as also having ADHD, or they may in fact be twice exceptional and be both, right? Be gifted and have ADHD. Sometimes this can result in some difficulties with what we call executive functions. Executive functions are things that happen in the front part of the brain and really correlate highly to academic success. So it's goal-directed behavior, short-term memory, being able to get that piece of homework from school to home, do something with it, get it back to school and get it turned in. Sometimes our kids that we lovingly refer to as absent-minded professors, you know, they're super, super smart, but gosh forbid they turn in their homework. Sometimes that can be because of psychomotor overexcitability. What's really cool about these kids, though, is they tend to just be pretty independent. They tend to be really good at taking action when they need to. So they can be a really fun group to be around too. Sensual overexcitability, these are the kids who really are impacted with those five senses, right? They're very, very impacted by their environment and by the sensory information that's coming in. They tend to have a very strong appreciation for the arts, for nature, for beauty. They tend to have a very strong memory of sensory information. This can result when it's underdeveloped or a little out of balance for them as being very hypersensitive to their environment. It can also then, if they're hypersensitive to their environment, they might perceive threats a little bit more readily, which can start to look like anxiety or start to look like a panic issue. What's really cool about them, though, is that they tend to have this great appreciation or awe about the world. And they tend to just be really in tune with kind of the environmental aspects of the world and the impact that that has, which also has a lot of strengths. My daughter, who's the professional artist, has really strong sensual overexcitability and imaginational overexcitability, serves her really well in the profession she has. The way her sensual overexcitability comes out really has to do with her perception of light and color, and how finely tuned it is. It's really kind of amazing the way she can differentiate color. I've not seen many people who can do it. It's kind of fascinating. All right, let's talk about imaginational. So one of the things that you don't know about me is I'm also a fiction author, and I see the world as a series of movies, especially when I'm dreaming, because I have really strong imaginational overexcitability, like really strong. And so this is a good thing, bad thing, right? So on a good thing, I have this really strong sense of imagination. I'm super creative. I have sagas for dreams, which can be a little exhausting some nights, let me assure you. Where it can be problematic is I can really misinterpret threats in the environment because of my imagination. The example I like to give of this is I was driving in Pennsylvania one time, and I'm driving through literally a cornfield. I was in Lancaster County, and it's early in the morning, and it's fall, so the fog is hugging the ground. It was stunning. But I am a fiction writer, and I happen to write psychological thrillers. So you can imagine what storylines are getting created in my mind as I'm driving through this very atmospheric condition. And if I didn't understand that this is just how my brain works, I could be kind of scared by this stuff going on in my head, as could other people if they knew what was going on in my head. But our imaginational overexcitability can be really interesting and exciting. For children, oftentimes this will look like somebody with a strong imagination, and they might even be creating stories in their mind when they're bored at school. So it can sometimes look like inattention. It can sometimes look like just really, really creative people. I was talking with a parent of a gifted child just recently, and that child is a middle school age child, and she was telling me that the child had written over 60 stories so far. So can't wait to have deeper conversations with the child about those stories. But she is a great example of somebody who has strong imaginational overexcitability. She also gets very overwhelmed by the environment, which then the central overexcitability coupled with, she happens to be a twice exceptional kiddo. So with some of the other things going on with her neurologically kind of result in that. And it can mean that at school, she can get really overwhelmed. And so part of how we support her is just supporting that and those environmental pieces. All right, I've done a whole lot of talking. I'm going to go through a couple of quick strategies with you, and then that'll leave us about 10 minutes or so for some questions here at the end. All right, so what do we do with all this information? How do we help our gifted kids like grow and develop and support some of that social emotional piece? So we're going to start off with the extreme basics, right? Foundationally, we really want to have good parenting skills in place. So clearly defined expectations, consequences for behavior, like all that stuff needs to be there. But at the same time that's all that's there, we also have to allow space for that emotional thing that's going to happen. We know that our gifted kids have big emotions. We need to create safe spaces where they can express those emotions and process through those emotions and see those emotions as a normal, functioning part of who they are. How they cope with some of those emotions might be problematic for them, right? Screaming at the top of your lungs because you are dysregulated is probably not very helpful. But recognizing, oh my gosh, I'm really overwhelmed, I need 5 minutes, and being able to learn how to articulate that, much more helpful, right? So having the big emotion, not the problem. How we're responding to that big emotion, that's the stuff that we can really get in there and do some work on. Let's see. Let's talk a little bit about a few other things that we can do. Another thing that's really, really important is developing trust, right? Whether this is trust with adults within the school environment or whether this is trust at home, these are really, really important aspects of helping our kids have environments where they can really mature some of those social emotional skills. So trust is a really, really big one. Sharing information with our kids, telling them how we learned how to manage our own emotions, having concern and compassion for our kids is really important. When our kids are having some big behavioral moments, learning how to connect with them first before we correct the behavior is really important. Now, as a parent, this one's tough, especially if it's at the end of the day, right? The kids never act up when we're rested. They always have an episode or a moment when we're ill prepared. We're at the grocery store, we're at the pickup line at school. It's always someplace where we're not always our most in control. And it's hard for us to remember to listen and reassure and validate before we respond. But the more we can connect, the more we can get really curious about why they're responding the way they're responding and operate from that perspective, the easier it is to start to pull some of this behavior into where we would like it. Let's do a couple of more. All right. So one of the things that I found really interesting when I was doing some research and thinking about tonight, we're going to talk about this in future sessions in a lot more detail, but there are ways that gifted kids grow up. There are messages that gifted kids grow up with as they're kind of growing up that can really influence how their resiliency develops. One is their perception of stress. And when we do some work around perfectionism and that kind of stuff, we're really going to go into that in a future session. But the other are these childhood stories. And that's kind of what I want to focus in on. So a lot of times our gifted kids get the message that they shouldn't talk about the things they're gifted in because it sounds like bragging and we shouldn't brag, right? Makes other people feel bad. And so the message in that, though, that they get is that they can't outshine others, that they have to dim who they are for the benefit of other humans. I don't think that's really the message we want to give humans, right? Do we want them to dim who they are? We might want them to learn to share the spotlight, right? We might want them to learn to not always have to be the center of conversation, but I don't think we really want them to dim who they are or to, not live up to their potential. And I think sometimes our gifted kids get that message. They also get the message that they're expected to be perfect. They think their parents are saying that to them. Trust me, I know, because I've asked them. And they think their teachers are saying to them. What I find so fascinating is when you actually talk to the parents and the teachers, that's not what they're telling you. In fact, parents and teachers are often worried that our gifted kids have too much perfectionism. So it's kind of funny to me because both sides is kind of doing this, right? As to who's to blame. The truth of the matter is gifted kids hold themselves to a high standard, and we as parents do exactly what we're supposed to do, which is help our kids live to their potential and kind of not let them off the hook when they're not. And all that turns into childhood messages that you're supposed to be perfect. And so the more we can do as parents to help kids know that that's not a thing, right? They don't have to be perfect. Sometimes this perfectionism and this don't outshine others turns into early childhood stories of I'm somehow flawed as a human being. The fact that I have these really big emotions means I'm too intense for others, and that's bad. Those are the messages that we want to reshape and help our children with and kind of change some of that. All right. The last thing I really want to kind of talk about a little bit, we'll go into some perfectionism stuff deeper the next time that we meet. I really, really want to spend a little time talking about ways we can change messages for kids, right? So I started off with this analogy of a coin, and I said that our gifted kids think that part of who they are, that intellectual part, is this fabulous thing that should be heralded and celebrated, and it's super cool. But the emotional part, not so much, right? That they're getting messages because of that emotional intensity that maybe they're a little bossy, or they're stubborn, or they're a perfectionist and that's not good, or they worry too much, or some of these kinds of things. So as parents, there's a lot we can do to change that message. And so I just wanted to share kind of a different word for each of these that can really speak to a different way that we can interact with our kids. When our kids are coming off as bossy, what that really is an indication is of leadership. So they might not be showing the most mature version of leadership that we'd ever want. And so we can help them with how that's coming up. But I want you to keep in mind that that bossiness isn't bossiness as a negative thing. It's really a leadership potential. Their stubbornness, that rigidity that we sometimes see, that's just perseverance, which is a very necessary skill in today's world and something we absolutely want them to have. So we want them to be stubborn. We just want them to learn some discernment around that. That perfectionist, as we've talked about all night, is really just high performance standards. That sense of worry is really an indication of their empathy. That's why they're worried. And so if we can help cultivate a healthy version of empathy and not always think of it as, oh my gosh, my kid just is so anxious, they worry all the time, we might have a different result with our kids. Our kids tend to ask excessive questions, and that excessive questioning is really just around being curious. And again, that over emotionality, that deep emotional intensity really, really, really is just passion. And our kids need passion. There wasn't anything that has been created on this planet that wasn't created with a whole lot of passion. So it's definitely something we want. And with that, we have some time to answer some questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen in just a moment here. All right.
Okay, thank you. We do have some questions that Ms. Arjoyan and I have been keeping track of, and I'll start with the very first one here. Are there tools parents can utilize for the kids themselves to recognize their needs, and what tools they have available to help them?
Sure. So first and foremost, it's really important that our gifted kids understand what it means to be gifted. And those are conversations that can happen at home. There's various different books on the topic. I wrote some of those books, but there's other books as well that are both for parents and for kids on ways to discuss what it means to have a gifted brain. I get parents who ask me all the time whether or not that's something we should tell our kids. Like, do I tell my kid they're gifted? And what I always tell parents is this: we can choose not to tell our kid that, but they already know that they're different. And if we don't give them a label and an understanding of what that difference is, they're going to make one up, and it's usually not a positive one. So we want to be able to share with our children information about their brain. When I work with kids, I always say, let me introduce you to your brain. I'm going to tell you all about it. And then you're going to tell me how that shows up in your life. So that's something. There are workbooks for kids, depending on their age, where they can explore some of this information independently. And then more and more and more schools are getting really good at kind of understanding this and having mental health teams at various schools that can help with some of this if there's something that's a little out of balance or out of whack. There's also within communities, gifted counselors are starting to learn more. There are all kinds of ways I recommend parents go about finding a counselor for a gifted kid, because there is misdiagnosis that can often happen if we don't understand the giftedness. So a little bit of caution, but yeah, there's tools.
Excellent. Next question. What is the best vocabulary to communicate to teachers about the kids' needs? Teachers may not know about anything about giftedness. So how can we communicate all this information in a 10 to 15-minute session? What do you suggest?
There you go. That's the $10 question right there, man. First and foremost, your teachers may not have as clear an understanding as giftedness as you want, but they absolutely know and want your kid to be successful within that environment. So I would start from the perspective of being a partner, right? How can we partner together and just be very honest and open with teachers about the difficulty your child may be having, whether it's they're bored with curriculum and so they just need a little bit more academic press, or they seem to be very emotional and I'm not sure what that's about. Can we partner together? But I think for both parties, if we're always treating this as a partnership, then together we can find information. If you as the parent have really locked into some truths about your kid, this is how the giftedness shows up, this is how we manage some of the emotionality at home, these are some things that have really worked, that's great information for a teacher, because they'll know how to translate that into workable within a school environment and be able to mimic some of those things that are effective for you.
Great, thank you. Next question. Is it necessary for at least one parent to be gifted for the child to be gifted?
Absolutely not, although there is some evidence that there's some genetic traits that are going to be true. There are anomalies that happen all the time. Just some kid pops out super, super gifted. Here's what I also know is true. So for the person who specifically asked this, odds are really good one of the two of you might be gifted and have no idea that you are. There are at least a handful of parents every single time I do this talk, and I've been doing this kind of a talk for about 20 years or so, and there's at least a handful of parents who go, oh my gosh, that was me. That explains so much. I had no idea. So if you're feeling that in any way, I encourage you to explore that a little bit. We got a whole lot of gifted adults out there who had no idea because that wasn't a thing when we were growing up.
I have a question I'd like to pose from one of the parents. How should I approach the middle schooler with social anxiety?
Yes.
And this is near and dear to me as a previous middle school teacher.
Yeah. So if your middle school child is feeling lots of school anxiety or social anxiety, and it may be resulting in school avoidance or coming home early, we're winding up in the nurse's office with headaches, stomach aches, etc. First and foremost, if you're at a middle school, talk to your counselor. Your counselors can be super, super helpful, and talk with the teacher if there's a localized reason for it. If it's a particular class, if it's social issues, that's a really good first source. My experience, I've worked middle school now for 20 plus years. That's near and dear to my heart as well. I'll retire working at a middle school. So, that's my love. And many of our gifted kiddos who are experiencing some social anxiety, it's really because this is where an awareness happens of just how unique they are at a time when developmentally there's this push to not stand out, to fit in with a particular group. And so there's a tough rub with that, and it can create some real anxiety. And a school counselor can be really helpful with that, or other mental health professionals that the majority of our school systems now have. I also want you to know, whoever asked that question, you're not alone. This is really common in our post-COVID world, by the way, super, super common. And so this is something that our teams on school sites are very, very good at working with. Oh, you're muted, whoever's.
There it is.
There.
Thank you. This next question actually covers a lot of ground, and I know a lot of it has to do with professional development. I'm going to ask it, and I know Ms. Arjoyan and I probably will answer the best we can in terms of what Glendale Unified is doing. But this is from one of our parents. My child displays many of the personality traits. Sometimes the anxiety manifests in school. Are we providing training for GUSD teachers about this topic? In particular, the kids in their classroom that are in the GATE program. I think they should also understand the emotional component of what our kids face, particularly anxiety and extreme moral concern. So the answer is yes. We do provide deep training. We partner with our teaching and learning department. We also are deeply partnered with student support services, student wellness services. It's definitely, we're very aware of it, and it's an ongoing process that we're constantly providing professional development across the board, not just with GATE, everyone, but in particular with this topic tonight. Yes, GATE is something that we're very aware of, and it does transcend into professional development. Ms. Arjoyan, did I miss anything else? I do want to mention while we're looking, for those of you that have written specific questions, we tried to do the best to answer them directly. We are available via email. You can look up our contact information on the district website, specifically our Department of Equity, Access, and Family Engagement. Please, by all means, contact us. There's also a local GATE contact at each of your child's school sites. That would be the first point of contact, but beyond that, we're here to support you as well from the district office perspective. Ms. Arjoyan, anything else? We do have a few more minutes.
There is one question I think
Go for it.
to pose when a student, because Ms. Fonseca, you're talking about reframing the student. So going from, you know, like asking too many questions, reframing it as it's curious kiddo. So this parent says, my daughter is very shy and it's standing in her way to try new things and to experience what she is capable of and stopping her from growing to her potential. I'm thinking of seeing a professional, but I'm afraid she thinks she has a problem. Can you advise on that?
So odds are really good if she's gifted, depending on her age. She has consulted Dr. Google and she has decided that she is something. This is just something that, yeah, I have to have this conversation with kids all the time, that Dr. Google is probably not your best source of information. So shyness is an aspect of emotional intensity, potentially. The good news is, so there's a couple of things to figure out. One, there's shyness and social anxiety as a disorder, right? Social anxiety. And then there's shyness, which is a behavior that can actually be really easily changed. And a mental health provider can help with either one. And there's also something called introversion. So a lot of times what happens is our gifted kids is a gifted introvert. Introverts are people who need some alone time to kind of renew socially and get very overwhelmed by their environments very easily. They tend to do better online, actually, or with texting, because we don't have that emotional interface that we do when we're in person. And they can really take on the emotions of others really easily. And so they get super overwhelmed, which leads to this shyness behavior. It's really important to see if that's an aspect of what's going on, because if it is, that's just kind of a need that they have that's innate, and there's things we can do around that to help work with that before it becomes super problematic, as opposed to this is just a behavior called shyness or a mental health concern called social anxiety. Hopefully that helps. But yes, mental health professionals, both localized at a school setting, if it's impacting her educationally, as well as within the community, can be very effective in helping with that.
Excellent. And I think that puts us at our time. And I know that there were some other questions that were on the board. We will address those. Some of them are very specific. I do want to make a blanket statement. For those of you here in attendance and those not maybe watching later, this isn't the only time we're going to be having this partnership with Mrs. Fonseca. It's not the only time we're going to have expert information shared with us. We're very grateful for this opportunity. We also have other scheduled events. So thank you for your attendance, and Ms. Fonseca for being here and sharing your knowledge. To our interpreters doing the background work, thank you for your hard work. And I do want to thank again Mrs. Arjoyan for her dedication and organization, not only for this GATE program, but for everything she does in our Equity, Access, and Family Engagement Department. So with that, I want to bid everyone a good night, and thank you very much for being in attendance. Thank you all.
Everyone. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I am going to stop recording.